social contract, that's a modern phrase, I guess. Was it invented by Rousseau? It was used by him. I don't know whether he invented it, but he wrote the book of that title.
Yeah, that's
was written in the 18th century. But Plato now takes up that question. These people argue that the origin of justice is simply a compact that people make as a kind of a truce in a war. That is, what they say is, well, look, we'll tear each other to shreds. If you want to get what you want and I want to get what I want, we'll kill each other. And neither one of us will get what he wants. So why don't we sit down and draw up a contract and say, well, honesty is the best policy. That is, we'll draw up here a thing where we'll say, well, you won't steal from me and I won't steal from you. And the reason is that I don't have the power to steal from you. If I did, of course I would. But since you're pretty strong too, and I might lose, what I'll say is, okay, we'll do unto others as we would have them do unto us. And that is the reason for morality. Now that is not, you see, Socrates says, boy, that's a terrible idea. What you're really saying is we'd all murder and lie and cheat and steal, but we're afraid. We're just cowards. And we know we can't get away with it, and so we'll draw up a thing we call a contract, and that will be our government. That will be our constitution. That will be our law.
The idea is enunciated very clearly by Thomas Hobbes before Rousseau. Rousseau is a much more subtle man, I should say, than Thomas Hobbes was. Hobbes is somewhat earlier, the English philosopher, and his great book was called the Leviathan, the great monster, the Leviathan from the Bible. He takes his name from there. It's a very, very telling kind of brilliant metaphor. And he says that's the state, and it's created by man. Man creates the state. Because, exactly as Mr. Senior says, he is afraid of his neighbor. Man, this is based on a fundamentally negative idea, pessimistic idea about the nature of man. Man is by nature rapacious, and he strives for power. That's the essential quality of human nature, is the struggle for superiority and for power. And therefore, you have to create, he says, the natural condition, the state of nature, as he calls it, is a state of war. Now, the only way that you can have peace is for each man to give up some of his rights to the state. And then the state will create a police force and a system of courts and justice to maintain order in the state and prevent people from killing each other and stealing from each other. And that has become something like the almost universally accepted idea of the origin of the state. And once again, we find that Glaucon is describing he's giving the idea of the nature of the state and the nature of all political activity that is simply the prevailing idea, and it's still the prevailing idea.
I'm afraid, as I say, it's our idea. This is why the dialogue is so urgent. The reason why you must read this book is this: it will shake your complacency. That is, when you get through reading this, you may not end up knowing what justice is. You may not end up being convinced that a lot of the things that Socrates says is right or are right, but you'll know one thing. And I think that is the end that Socrates has in mind. He wants to shake us out of this complacency. You may put it this way: the shadow of Socrates' death hangs over every word that Plato writes. That is, he sees that if this view of ethics and politics and everything else, as a matter of fact, prevails, then the consequence will be the execution of the just man. That is, there will be no way that Socrates will prevail. And we as Christians can see that there's no way that Christ can prevail. That is, the truth, the good and the truth cannot prevail. I was just going to say, before we go forward to, because we're going to be talking about this, I think, for the rest of the next, we'll have to put it in the metaphor of tapes, for the next 3 or 4 tapes. I was going to say for the next 3 or 4 weeks. But I think it is important, just for a moment, to throw back to that line that I quoted when Socrates says, when he listens to Glaucon, he says, "Nothing could please me more. For on what subject would a man of sense rather delight to hold and hear discourse again and again?" That is, this touches on what we began with, the poetry of this occasion. That is, what Socrates really says here is, what delights me is that we have a conversation about these things. That we discourse about them on a serious, high level among friends. He really loves these 2 men now, Glaucon and Adeimantus. They are his dearest friends, and he delights in sitting down and talking to them. Whereas before he was in a kind of an argument, which is not the same thing as a conversation. As the thing about Thrasymachus is, you can't really delight in talking to him.
Well, we say he simply has a bad will.
Yeah.
You can't really talk to the bad-willed man. I think a lot of people make mistakes about this. They think that if you just talk to the bad-willed man long enough, and give him enough arguments and enough statistics and enough data, that you can overcome his bad will. You're going about it in the wrong way.
One of the things we had to contend with at the university here, and it would be true at any university in the nation, critics were always saying to us, well, you people come into class and you sit down and you talk about these things, but you're friends. Now, education, they would say to us, is essentially a debate. Why don't you get somebody who holds the other position and allow him to come into your class and maintain that position? And we always said, well, if we did that, that would be an endless prelude to the course. That is, we'd be always going over and over the battle with Thrasymachus.
And in doing that, we would be teaching the students that is what education and what philosophy is.
We speak that.
We would be actually teaching them something. That is, that clash of opinion, that is essentially what educators do. It's essentially what the educated man does. That is, that education does not somehow is not conducive to friendship, but that it is rather conducive to a kind of antagonism.
It's a war, isn't it?
It's a war.
Okay.
And that you're conceding the position of Thomas Hobbes. That is, that the natural state is a state of war. And that's precisely what people who hold this view about education say. So that's essentially what education is. You get 2 people in there with irreconcilable views, opinions, which they hold, and they will never change. Because, of course, if they changed, if in the middle of the argument, in the first class, and you had this imaginary antagonist in there, and he said, in the middle of the thing, he said, well, by George, you're right.
And then you have to get somebody else.
I never thought of it that way. You're absolutely right. I don't know why I never saw that. Well, you'd have to kick him right out of that class. It wouldn't work.
There's an ambiguity in the word dialectic. These are dialogues that Plato wrote. And Plato, in some of his dialogues, talks about a mode of reasoning which is called dialectic. But in the modern world, the word dialectic has changed its meaning again. Uh, Marx uses it, and before him, the German philosopher Hegel. And the modern use of the word dialectic is precisely that. It's a clash of opposing opinions. And out of the clash of A and B comes some kind of synthesis known as C, but then immediately the process is repeated because somebody will clash with that. And so they think of education, politics, and everything else as being this endless clash of opposites. Now that is not what Socrates does. No, absolutely not at all. And yet you hear it said that he does. I've heard people say, well, why don't you follow the Socratic method? And we'd say, well, what's that? And he'd say, well, the free, open clash, the marketplace, as the Nobel Prize winner seems to say, the marketplace of ideas, exactly as in the economic order. They argue there should be this free competition. Isn't that the word they use? Free competition.
Well, you notice again how the idea of the will and power has entered back into the discussion. You see, the minute you say war, clash, controversy, competition, right away you're talking about two people who are out there fighting against one another. What became of the idea that there's something to be known, rather than somebody, an antagonist to be overcome? That's we alluded once briefly to the idea of debating. The debate, and this is what Thrasymachus thinks that he's engaged in, is a debate. He says, well, what we need here is a jury. He said, who's going to decide who's right, who wins the argument? You see, there has to be a winner in an argument, according to Thrasymachus' way of thinking, because he thinks of it as a power struggle. And you have to get somebody to award the prize to the person who's made the best argument. And Socrates says, well, what we can be, we ourselves are the ones who will decide.
He says, I want you.
He says you.
He says, I want you. Because what he means is, I want you to see, that this is true. Thrasymachus doesn't understand that at all.
No, it's like my idea of the man who comes in and I used to debate myself in high school. I found high school very boring. There wasn't anything to do with it. There was certainly very little to be learned in high school. And I took up debating, and I got to be very good at it. I don't say that to boast, quite the contrary. But I had a debating partner who was very ineffective as a debater. He was a very good friend of mine. And many years later, I found out why he was so ineffective. He didn't have the desire to win. I always had the desire to win. I wanted to mow my enemies down, and I could beat them. It didn't make any difference which side we were on. You take one side one week and another side the next week, and it all has to do with how effective your arguments are, or how effective you are as a speaker. And this partner of mine, he finally confessed to me many years later. He said, and my heart was never in debating. He said, I'd get up and present my side of the case, and then I'd sit down, and the other guy would come up and present his side of the case, and I'd listen to him, and I'd say, I think he's right. He'd be convinced by the other guys. And you can't be a debater and do that. Then you have nothing to say when you come up to refute your enemies. But he was right, of course. He was right. That is, he was trying to really grapple with the issue. And obviously, in debate, if you do that, you're lost. You're no longer in the spirit of debate at all.
It's kind of amusing because later on in this same book, I'm leafing through. With tapes running out, you kind of hear Time's winged chariot here, and you hate to mess around.
Yeah,
but they're doing okay. I'm looking for a passage when further on in book 2, when Socrates begins to talk about the state itself and the republic itself. The conversation moves from what is right and wrong for us personally to, what do we mean as it operates at large in the nation? And he starts talking about education, And he says that one of the things that we're going to have to do is get rid of the received material. That is, get rid of, in a way, he says, one of the things we're going to have to do is get rid of our tradition. And he actually, well, actually, no, I'm this is in book 3. That's why I couldn't find it. It's on into the next book. But he says one of the things we're going to have to do is get rid of poetry. This is one of the most famous things that Socrates says, because he says poets are always spouting opinions, and they don't really deal with philosophic truth. And at one point, he says, just listen to this. Look, he said, how bad even Homer is. Now, he said, of course, we know we're supposed to censor pornography, and we know we're supposed to get rid of, even trivial things and silly things, of course. But he says even the greatest poets really are no good, because they don't represent things as they ought to be. He says, for example, imagine a poet representing the wisest man in his book. Now that's Odysseus, and the poet is Homer. Imagine him representing the wisest man as saying that this seems to him to be the fairest thing in the world. And then he quotes these lines. Didn't we quote them last time?
We said that with the translation we have is something like perfection.
Something like perfection. Here it is the translator says, when the bounteous tables are standing laden with bread and with meat, and the cupbearer ladles the sweet wine out of the mixer and bears it and empties it into the beakers. He says, do you think that hearing that sort of thing will conduce young men to temperance and to self-control? Or this, he says. And he goes on and on. And we put the book down and we say, well, he's referring to that line that we took as the very epitome of the greatest lines in the whole of the Odyssey, and as summing up the whole case for poetry. Now, the reason I got onto that was, listen to this sentence again. When Glaucon says that he really wants to go on and get to the bottom of this, Socrates says, nothing could please me more, for on what subject would a man of sense rather delight to hold and hear discourse again and again? Now we have here two different views of what discourse ought to be. And as Homer says, nothing could be better than to hear a bard strike up the lyre and sing a great poem, sing a great song, while the wine is being passed around. And Socrates says, no, that's not what our banquets ought to be like. Now they both agree that the greatest thing in the world is sitting around a table. But Homer says the greatest thing to do when you sit around a table is to have good wine, good meat, and good bread, and then to have a poet come and strike up the lyre and to sing a song. So Socrates says, no. The greatest thing that you can do at a table is to sit down and have a really good conversation about justice, and to get to the bottom of things in a philosophic way. Now, what we're going to maintain in our talk is, boy, in a quarrel like this, I don't care who wins. That is, both of these are great. But I think we did insist last time in saying that it's a step down. That is to Socrates. Which is not to say that that's very far down. It's not to say that it isn't one of the greatest things in the world. But that Homer is right about something. And that Socrates' criticism, while important and well taken, overlooks something. Maybe again by a deliberate kind of play.
Yes, I think just by way of an aside, you should bear in mind that if you were to read all of the works of Plato, where Socrates speaks, as he so often does in those dialogues, you would find him saying rather different things from time to time about poetry. This is one of the troubling things about Socrates. This is very famous, of course. His criticism of poetry is in the Republic is very famous. But I think probably you ought to read the very last dialogue, the Phaedo. I think it's the Phaedo, where Socrates is found, or is it in the Crito, where he's found in his cell at the end of his life, putting the
that's the Crito, I guess,
because
that's the very
they're putting the fables of Aesop into verse.
He's writing poetry,
right? And he's writing a hymn to Apollo, and he says the reason he's doing that is that once he was told by his spirit, this God who speaks to him, he was told that he ought to make music. And he said, I always interpreted that as meaning philosophy, because philosophy is the highest kind of music. But he said, I'm not so sure. He said, just to be safe, he said, he really does say this. He says, just to be on the safe side, I've decided that maybe I ought to write some poetry to Apollo, a hymn to Apollo, and also
who's the
god of music, and just to be sure, that perhaps I've been wrong about that interpretation of the thing. It's very strange, but he really did do that. There as he was dying, he was thinking about that he wasn't making a joke.
This is what I think people mean by Socratic irony. And again, you said he wasn't making a joke. Here he's making the joke.
Yeah.
I think that is. I do believe that this is one of Socrates' deep philosophical jests. That is, he's very serious, but at the same time, there is a joke involved in the seriousness. Socrates is never more serious than
when he's joking.
Yes. That is the play that comes in here. For one thing, look how he quotes those lines from memory. That is clearly he loves those lines, otherwise he wouldn't be able to quote them. He knows them by heart. When the bounteous tables are standing laden with bread and meat, you see. But he is holding Homer up to a philosophic light here and saying, there is something about the poets that they don't really know what they're doing, and they do have to be judged. There's something, if music is the language of love, and love takes precedence over knowledge, we were arguing that last time, that from the point of view of perfection, love is closer, because perfection is something always higher and always beyond us, and we can never really grasp it. And so our love runs ahead of our knowledge. That's true. But Socrates insists on making this point. You have to have knowledge too, otherwise love will run away, and you won't know whether it's higher or lower. That is, there is a kind of judgment that knowledge makes about love and holds its reins. That's very important, and that's why he insists that poetry be censored. Now, in the Republic, he makes a case such as to be almost preposterous, but I can't help but think that it's a kind of a joke when he says, what would this do to a young man's temperance? As if to say, what a terrible poem. To give a young man the Odyssey, he'll go out and become a drunkard if he does that. The editor here, Mr. Shorey, I've mentioned his name 2 or 3 times because most editors, I must say, are just terrible people. They give the most abominable footnotes. But this fellow,
his footnotes are always worth reading.
He's very, very bright and very funny.
He's in the conversation.
And he loves Plato, and he argues, yes, he's in the conversation, that's exactly right. He refers at this point to a dialogue by a secondary classical writer named Lucian. Lucian, Lucian. Now, Lucian is not a great writer, but he's awfully good. He lived in the 2nd century A.D. That is, he lived on into the times of the Christian times of the Roman Empire, although he was not a Christian at all. There's no evidence that he was. But he was a famous rhetorician, and he went around giving speeches and talks and so on, and he wrote a series of parodies of the Platonic dialogues, which are just hilariously funny. And he's got one called The Parasite. And in this dialogue called The Parasite, he says at the beginning, there's a big argument in the world between philosophers and poets and rhetoricians. There's an art, he said, known as dialectic. And there's an art of rhetoric, and there's an art of poetry. And they argue endlessly about which one of these is the best. Now, I'll tell you, he says, one which is really the best. He calls it parasitic. Now, at one point in the dialogue, finally, the man he's arguing with, and it's a beautiful parody of Socrates arguing with anybody in the world, this fellow says, well, do you have a definition? You remember, Socrates insists that you can't go anywhere without a definition. So he says, well, yes, he says, give us a first-class definition of parasitic. And Simon, who is the Socrates here, says, it seems to me that the definition might be best expressed thus. Parasitic is that art which is concerned with food and drink, and what must be said and done in order to obtain them, and its end is pleasure. And Tychiades says, that to my mind is a tip-top definition of your art, but you better be very careful whenever you use the word end, because you're going to get into an argument with the philosophers. That is, what is the telos? What is the end of the whole thing? And Simon says, it'll be quite sufficient if I can show that happiness and parasitic are the same, because happiness is that which has to do with the end. Now, this fellow, Lucian, has read. He's read his Aristotle and his Plato here. You know, he's a very learned guy. So he says, what I'm going to show is that parasitic and eudaimonia, happiness, have the same end. And I can prove it immediately this wise. Homer himself, admiring the life of a parasite, on the ground that it alone is blessed, says. And he quotes that very same passage. See? And he goes on about, he says, this is a thing that to me in my heart does seem, and the word in Greek is kalista, and that's the one that's used for most perfect, or the life of perfection, or that which is very good, or the best. For he says that he counts nothing else on earth happy but to be a parasite. And then he quotes the lines, you see, I for my own part hold, and this is Odysseus speaking, that there is no end more delightful than when cheerfulness reigneth supreme over all the people. Banqueters down the long halls give ear to the bard as he singeth, sitting in regular order, and by each man is a table, now see the parasite, laden with bread and with meat, while the server from out of the great bowl dippeth the mead and beareth and poureth into the beakers. And Professor Shorey has this line in his thing. He says, this passage of Homer is liable to abuse. See the use made of it by Lucian, see, in the parasite. Well, I think we have to read the whole thing in this context. Sure, I mean, you could make fun of it, but obviously that's not what Homer was talking about. And if you want to pick up the other footnote, he says very slyly, for the other view, see Aristotle. Well, didn't we already talk about this? Or did we talk about it somewhere else? My memory.
We talked about it once, but I can't remember whether we talked about it in this series.
In this series, or did we or not?
I don't think so.
That is, at the very end, I think really what we ought to say here is read the entire 8th book, which is the last book of the politics, where Aristotle talks about education, and he says there are four subjects.
Oh, yeah,
of
we
education.
started.
Didn't we
with that.
start
Yes,
out
that's
with that?
where we started,
That is
right.
letters, gymnastic,
Right.
music, and drawing. And he says particularly important is music, and he puts it this way. He says most people take part in music merely for the sake of pleasure. But those who originally included it in education did so because, as has often been said, nature itself seeks to be able not only to engage rightly in business, but also to occupy leisure nobly. For to speak about it yet again, this is the first principle of all things. I'm sure I read that aloud, and we talked about that for an hour.
Mm-hmm.
And Aristotle here doesn't just say this is, an important subject, but he says this is the first principle. For if, although both business and leisure are necessary, yet leisure is more desirable and more fully an end than business, we must then inquire what is the proper occupation of leisure. And later on, he quotes these exact same lines. The banquetter seated in due order throughout the hall may hear the minstrel sing. And he says that this is the purpose of music, and I'm sure I quoted those lines. It teaches men to be able to rejoice rightly. That's Aristotle's conclusion there. So when we go back to Socrates, talking to Glaucon and Rhadamanthus here, saying, what I want to do is sit down here and rejoice with you over this great subject, of justice. He's really carrying out a kind of music. He's really doing what Homer does in a different way.
That's what I was going to say. That is that remark of his, which never struck me before. I don't know what made me happen to read it again in the Crito, where he's talking. I think I went back to read the passage because I remembered that he talks there about translating Aesop as one of the last things that he did, and he says there that he's doing this. That he had always been obeying the god, he thought, in philosophizing, because the god said that he ought to pursue music, that was what he ought to do, was pursue music. And he said, well, I always took that to mean pursue philosophy, because philosophy is the highest kind of music. But there is another way of looking at it. I noticed in one of the dialogues, and I can't even remember which one it is, it's one of the minor dialogues, that Socrates said that he was going, or he had just come from taking flute lessons. He has a music teacher. He's a very old man. He's still taking music lessons.
He condemns the flute here.
Yes, master.
In the Republic.
I think it's the flute.
He condemns the flute.
I know. But I hear it's one of those minor dialogues that I've never even read.
I don't remember that at all.
I don't think it's a dialogue I've never read before, and I sat down and read it because I've never read it. And he says that he just meets somebody. He says, "Well, I just come from so and so who's my master," and I think he said the flute. And you just say, well, really, the references to music and the quotation of poetry, this whole dialogue starts, you might remember, from remembering a poet who said that justice is the giving of
each his due.
Each his due. Yes, that's where the whole dialogue started from.
Simonides, yeah.
The Simonides, a quotation from a poet, and that principle is never exactly repeated again, but it's true. That's the correct definition. I mean, that's the definition that Aristotle invented.
It isn't at the end, it's at the beginning, isn't
Yeah,
it?
and there it's cited at the very beginning of the dialogue, and everybody just pays no attention to it at all. I suspect that Socrates would have, if you'd have asked him if he was willing to give you a definition, that would have been the one he would have given. But he doesn't, of course, want to start with it. He never starts with a definition. I mean, not with a...
Well, that's part of the poetry of this whole book. That is, that whole first scene, this old man, Cephalus, starts to talk to Socrates, and he says, "Oh, I'm not interested in philosophy. I'm too old."
Yeah.
He says, "I'm retired." In other words, he's in a state of leisure. And he says, for you young people who have to struggle through life, and you're going to go into politics, and you're going to be involved in the law courts and things. And these young men were pretty much training for a political career. That was the great career of Athens, as it is in any republic, and it still is in our day. And you fellows talk. I don't want to talk about that, he said. As far as I'm concerned, and he quotes a poet, and Socrates doesn't say much.
Doesn't say a word. Well, you remember what old Cephalus does. He leaves them, and what is he doing? Well, he says, "I'm going out and make an offering to the gods." That's what he's going to do. He said, "That's what I have to do now. I have to go make an offering to the gods." Well, what is that? What kind of an act is that? Well, if you asked Socrates, he would say, well, that's an act of justice. That's what we have to do. We owe something to the gods. We owe everything to the gods. And if you make a sacrifice, then you are giving the gods, you're attempting to give the gods their due. Old Cephalus knows, he does know what wonder is. Now, he may not be able. You see, and he simply accepts the old definition, but he has achieved a certain wisdom. He knows that what he has to do is to honor the gods, and he goes off and does justice rather than engaging in the conversation.
But there it is. These young men who are just about to enter into the struggle for life, they're troubled by this question. And I know that our students are always troubled by this question. It comes up whenever you get serious about anything. Mr. Quinn, for example, you mentioned just a few minutes ago, for some reason or other, I forget the context, but you mentioned right and wrong, apropos of this terrible question of our time about abortion and the right to life movement. And one of the questions that frequently comes up with us teaching at universities is, well, do you really think it's right to waste time reading Homer and Plato when there are innocent children being murdered right here in this city? That is, why don't we come down off this hill, this academy where we sit up here in this ivory tower, and we sit here and we read these books, and we leisurely go on and on talking about this great discourse, and that Socrates says is the most delightful thing in the world, when down there at the foot of the hill there are clinics and hospitals where babies are being murdered. Let us go down and let's get that job done. And after we get that job done, maybe we'll come back. But this is certainly no time for the kind of thing that you are talking about. We have to stop and we have to say, now look, is it true or not that there are higher things and lower things? This gets in Christian vocabulary to be the quarrel about the contemplative versus the active life. And in philosophic terms, it's the philosophic life versus the life of the sophist, who says, I don't care. We'll be here all night if we argue about what justice is. We'll never get to the end of it. And Socrates says, well, that's true. Well, I admit that. Because once you get started on this, we're not going to come up with the answers to these questions right away. Well, then, babies are being killed down here. I mean, let's get down there and do the job. We hear this from our students all the time. And we have to, the tears come to your eyes over this. These questions are not abstract things out of a book. They are questions out of our lives right here and now. Don't we have to compromise our education, for example? I mean, we can't study these things. We've got to learn something practical. Another way it comes up, of course, in a lesser way is over the making of money and the career. I mean, well, if I've got to take a course in business administration, how am I going to make a living? I can't spend my 4 years here at college reading Socrates, reading Plato.
You will find when you get to read the Apology, you really ought to read the Apology. One of the things you'll find there is that Socrates says that he had one experience with politics where he found that his attempts to make the truth prevail were unavailing, and he quit. And then he realized that he should not, that politics was antagonistic to his mission as a philosopher, and that he would never have anything to do with politics again, because he saw that his vocation, his calling was to philosophy, and he had to pursue the career of a philosopher. Now, certainly, there is no doubt at all that philosophy is a higher pursuit than the pursuit of politics. We're not disparaging politics. We're only trying to put it in its proper place, where it belongs. It belongs. You said that's the geography around here. We're at a place where the university is on the top of the hill.
They usually are.
Where they very frequently are. Exactly. Well, the academy was in a temple. Really, originally it was a temple. It's a kind of sacred place, and it's on a high place. And the affairs of the world are downtown, as we say, taking place down there. Which doesn't mean they are to be neglected or despised necessarily, but that really you can't possibly understand or see those things properly unless you have, first of all, gone to the hill, to the place where you can see the whole thing. Philosophy, one of the things that philosophy attempts to do is to see not only this truth or that truth, not just the truth about politics or the state, but to try to see the whole thing. That's the only place that you can see the whole thing from, is up on the hill. And philosophy does attempt to see the whole thing.
One of the things we were told so many times is you had better come to the campus political activities. You had better come to the assemblies where education and all these things were being debated. And we would always say, well, see, we have to read the Republic today. We can't go out and do those things. Our job is to read these books. And people would say, almost word for word out of the Republic, if you keep that up, the bad guys are going to take over and you'll be crucified. And well, what you have to say is, well, what about that? Is it not true? And now, see, we have to bring this argument, if we can, somehow bring it home. If you take this book seriously, you're going to lose. Thrasymachus is going to win. Thrasymachus believes in winning the race, and nothing but winning the race. He doesn't believe in winning it rightly. But if you once take up the idea that there is a right, there is a good, you are in the position of the crucified, which in philosophical order is the position of Socrates. We're so afraid of running out of time now that we're silent, because we realize that it would be wonderful if you could end on the right note instead of in the middle of a sentence. But the better part of the kind of conversation we're in is not perfection, I think. But this is why good people hold the position of Thrasymachus, not bad people. That is. Sure, bad people hold it. They want to win by hook or crook. But good people want to win by hook or crook. Good people say, well, if we don't use this particular means, then these bad things will happen. And so they'll make the lesser choice. There are students who say, well, we have to come down off the hill and we have to protest against abortion. And there are students who say, well, we have to engage in politics because if we don't, we won't even be able to protect the hill. That there is a contradiction in what Socrates says here, that if we all went up to the top of the hill, and if we all engaged in poetry and philosophy, the world, the practical world, wouldn't run at all.
But you have to ask what your business is, what your business is in the world. The contemplative order is in itself higher than the order of action. The truth, the knowledge of the truth, the service of the truth is a higher order than the order of action and politics.
Suppose everybody entered contemplative orders. Well, St. Thomas takes that question up and says it's not a very serious question because they never will.
Yes.
That is, given the state of the world, that won't happen. But if it did, why, we'd be in the kingdom of heaven. Well, there'd certainly be nothing wrong with that. Suppose everyone were happy. Well, what a wonderful thing.